I'm definitely ready to navigate these waters with you.
So you know how you always hear that phrase, China has 5,000 years of culture? It's just sort of out there, accepted.
It's a very common statement, almost a tagline.
But we started digging into some really interesting stuff, and it makes you wonder, is it really that straightforward? Hey everybody, and welcome back to Sip and Talk.
Great to be here.
So today on this deep dive, our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to unpack this whole 5,000 years of Chinese culture idea.
Okay.
We're going to look at, when did China as a concept actually form? What's the difference between cultural history and, say, national history?
But how does this stack up against how other places tell their stories, like the U.S. or countries in Africa?
Precisely.
Yeah.
We've got some fascinating sources lined up, so buckle up. Okay, so let's jump right into this 5,000 years thing. What our sources are suggesting is, well, it might not be quite as simple as it sounds.
Right. The first big point is the definition of China itself.
Yeah, the modern nation state we call China today. That's actually relatively recent, like 19th, 20th century is recent.
Before that, the term China often meant something different. Maybe the Central Plains area or the cultural heartland, Xia, Shang, Zhou dynasties.
The geography, the political boundaries, they were really different back then. It wasn't this massive unified country on the map necessarily.
And the first real push towards a truly centralized state, that unified empire idea, that's usually pegged to the Qin dynasty.
Which was way back, but not 5,000 years ago, right? More like 221 BCE.
Exactly. So that's a key marker, but still much later than the 5,000-year starting point.
And this is where it gets tricky, isn't it? The difference between culture and politics.
Precisely. That 5,000 years often starts with legendary figures like the Yellow Emperor or the Xia dynasty, which itself is, its existence is debated.
Right. Possibly legendary.
And that emphasizes the cultural continuity language, maybe Confucian ideas later on, rituals, certain shared practices.
But that cultural thread, that doesn't automatically mean there was one single continuous political China for all that time.
No, it doesn't. Cultural continuity and political continuity are two different things.
It's like saying, because people in Britain have spoken some form of English for ages, the modern political entity of the UK has existed that whole time. Doesn't quite track.
That's a good analogy. And another thing our sources bring up is the evidence, the archaeology.
The Xia dynasty.
Yeah, it's still somewhat debated, not as solid as later periods. Reliable written history, the kind historians really sink their teeth into, that starts with the Shang dynasty.
Okay, and when was that?
Around 1600 BCE.
Oh.
So if you're talking documented history.
We're looking closer to 3,500 years.
That's right. Which is still incredibly long, but it's not quite 5,000.
So it brings up that question, where do you start the clock? Myths, archaeology, a clear political state.
And leaning on those earlier, maybe mythical figures, this definitely helps build a very powerful cultural story, a narrative of deep roots.
So, okay, when did this concept of China start looking more like the China we think of now? Our sources kind of trace this evolution.
Well, in the early days, like the Zhou dynasty, China, or Zhongwu, was more about culture and geography.
Like us in the Central Plains versus them, the so-called barbarians on the outside.
Exactly. It was a cultural distinction, a sense of being central, civilized, but not necessarily a modern nation with, defined borders and citizenship in the way we understand it.
Right. No passport control back then?
Not quite. Then you get to the Qin and Han dynasties. That's a big shift.
How so?
That's when China starts getting really tied to the idea of a centralized empire, imperial rule. And the Han dynasty, especially 206 BCE to 220 CE, our sources highlight this as a period that really solidified a common Huaxia cultural identity.
Huaxia.
Yeah, it's a term often used to refer to the core Chinese civilization or people. The Han period really laid down a strong cultural foundation that later dynasties, later ideas of China would build on.
So a stronger cultural core starts to form.
Definitely. Expansion of territory, more standardized practices, a sense of shared identity deepened.
And then we fast forward quite a bit to get to the modern nation-state idea.
Right. That really comes into focus much later, late 19th, early 20th centuries. And Western ideas about nationalism actually played a role there too.
Interesting. So influenced by the West in that sense.
To some extent, yes. The pressures of that era, encountering Western powers, internal upheavals, it pushed towards defining China as a modern nation.
And then, of course, you have the Republic of China in 1912 and the People's Republic in 1949.
And those are the entities that really cemented China as the name of a modern nation-state in the international system.
So it's a long evolution from a cultural idea to a defined political country.
Which leads to the question, can cultures just, describe themselves this way? Say, we're X thousand years old.
Yeah, is that a valid way to talk about history? Our sources look at this from a couple of angles.
On one side, there's the argument for continuity. Chinese culture has passed down elements for a very long time.
Like the written language, core philosophies like Confucianism and Taoism, certain traditions.
Exactly. So that 5,000 years isn't plucked out of thin air entirely. It speaks to a real sense of deep historical roots and cultural sharing over millennia.
And that has value, right? For cultural identity, for national pride, maybe even for tourism.
Absolutely. It's a potent narrative for building that shared identity.
But there's always a but.
But our sources also emphasize the need for, let's say, academic precision.
Meaning
we should be careful to distinguish the cultural streams from the political history of the state. They aren't always the same thing.
And acknowledging that the earliest parts of that 5,000 years are based more on legend or debated evidence, while the documented history is shorter.
Right. That distinction is important for historical accuracy.
And it feels like these descriptions are often quite subjective, don't they? They get tangled up with nationalism, building a particular story about who we are.
Very much so. Historical narratives are rarely completely objective. They often serve identity-building purposes. So China, using this long timeline to emphasize its civilization's endurance, is understandable.
But we as critical thinkers should probably just be aware of potential exaggeration or simplification.
Exactly. Keep that historical perspective in mind.
This makes you think, though, should history only count from when China as a political state actually existed?
Well, if you applied that rule really strictly,
you'd start the clock in 1912. Or maybe 1949. That's like 100 years, not 5,000.
That's the logical conclusion of a purely political definition, yes. Which feels like it misses a huge chunk of the story.
Yeah, our sources argue that doing that ignores all the cultural continuity that came before. The language, the philosophies, the art. That stuff predates the modern state by millennia and continued through different dynasties.
It's like your family history analogy, ignoring everything before you moved into your current house. You lose the context, the heritage.
Right.
And this isn't unique to China, apparently.
Oh.
Our sources mention other long-standing civilizations, like India or Egypt. They also often trace their history back to cultural origins, to ancient civilizations in their regions, not just from the founding date of the modern political nation.
Okay, so it's a common approach then, framing history through cultural lineage.
It seemed to be. It highlights how enduring culture can be, sometimes more so than specific political structures.
Okay, let's switch gears.
Right.
Let's talk about the good old US of A. Could we use the same logic?
How do you mean?
Could we say American culture is X years old, starting way back with, I don't know, the British, since we share the language, some legal roots?
That's a fascinating comparison, and our sources point out some key differences.
Like what?
Well, while U.S. culture obviously has British roots, language, common law, etc., a lot of its core identity developed after independence in 1776.
Things like?
Individualism, the specific form of democracy, its multiculturalism.
Yeah.
These are defining traits that emerge more distinctly in the American context.
Yeah, it feels like there was a deliberate break. The revolution wasn't just political, it was cultural too, creating a new world identity.
Exactly. The narrative emphasizes that separation, the forging of something new. So you don't typically hear Americans incorporating centuries of British history directly into American cultural history.
No, you don't say, we Americans have been having tea time for 800 years. Doesn't work.
Right. And then you have the indigenous cultures.
Who have been here for thousands and thousands of years.
Absolutely. But their history, while incredibly important and long, isn't usually framed as the starting point for mainstream American cultural history.
Why is that, according to the sources?
Largely due to the significant cultural discontinuities, the breaks caused by colonization and the formation of the U.S. nation-state. It's treated more as a separate foundational history of the land, rather than a direct precursor to modern American culture.
So U.S. cultural history usually gets dated from the colonial era, or 1776, maybe 400 years or so?
Generally, yes. The focus is on the period leading to and following the nation's founding, not tracing back millennia to Britain or pre-Columbian times for the nation's cultural narrative.
Okay, now let's hop over to Africa. Could countries there use this same logic, tracing back to the very dawn of humanity, since, that's where Homo sapiens originated?
That's an even more complex layer. Our sources definitely address this. While it's true, modern humans emerged in East Africa around 200,000 years ago.
Which is way longer than 5,000 years.
Way longer. But that's generally seen as the history of humanity, not the specific cultural history of, say, modern Nigeria or Kenya.
Right. It's like saying my personal ancestry goes back to Africa, therefore the history of modern Sweden, where I live now, started 200,000 years ago. It's a bit of a stretch.
Exactly. And Africa is, as you know, incredibly diverse. Thousands of ethnic groups, languages.
And the modern national borders often don't match up with ancient cultural groups or empires like Mali, Songhai, Ghana.
Precisely. That diversity makes it very hard for a single modern nation to claim that entire span of human origin as its own continuous cultural story.
So what can they trace back?
Individual nations or specific cultural groups within them can trace their history back to important regional kingdoms or ancient cultures, Great Zimbabwe, the Ashanti Empire, and so on.
But that's specific to certain groups or regions, not usually claimed as the unbroken history of the entire modern nation-state?
Generally, yes. Those are important parts of the national heritage, but distinct threads.
And then there's the impact of colonialism.
A major factor. Colonialism created huge disruptions, imposed new borders, new languages, new systems. It created significant cultural breaks.
So our sources suggest modern African cultural history is often viewed as starting either after independence in the mid-20th century or perhaps by tracing back to specific pre-colonial kingdoms.
That tends to be the focus, yes. Reconnecting with pre-colonial identities or forging new ones post-independence.
So trying to claim 200,000 years just doesn't have that direct cultural continuity or relevance for the modern nations.
Not in the same way the 5,000 years claim functions for China, which emphasizes a more continuous, albeit debatable, cultural core. The African context is vastly different.
Okay, bringing it back to China. This whole discussion makes that 5,000 years claim feel potentially like a rhetorical device, maybe even sophistry.
Our sources do explore that angle. The term sophistry implies a clever but possibly misleading argument.
Yeah, because if we applied that same kind of historical accounting linking modern states to any ancient culture in the same geography, the U.S. could claim, what, 15,000 years based on indigenous presence?
Theoretically, using that logic, yeah.
But we don't. And African nations could claim hundreds of thousands of years.
But they generally don't frame their national history that way either.
So the issue seems to be this potential blurring of concepts, confusing the modern nation with much older cultures.
That seems to be the core critique, extending the history of the modern political entity, China, back through millennia, encompassing various cultures that existed in the region.
Cultures like Yangshao, Liangzhu, even the Xia and Shang, retroactively including them under the umbrella of the modern nation's history.
Right, using the sovereignty of modern China to sort of absorb these earlier histories into a single linear national narrative. And that often carries strong nationalist undertones.
And this is where the sophistry idea might come in presenting this potentially selective or simplified narrative as straightforward fact.
It's about how the narrative is constructed and used. Projecting the modern identity backward can be seen as a form of historical appropriation, especially when it overlooks complexities or debates.
Plus, as we mentioned, there's the disputed evidence for the very start of that 5,000-year count, the Yellow Emperor, the Xia dynasty.
Exactly. The official narrative often smooths over those debates, presenting a more seamless story of continuity than many academic historians might accept.
So let's clarify again. When did China really emerge as a distinct political and cultural concept? What's the timeline, according to our sources?
Well, the idea of a distinct Wuxia culture, this sense of us in the Central Plains, that goes back quite far, even to the Western Zhou dynasty. That was about distinguishing themselves from surrounding groups.
Okay, so an early cultural identity.
Yes. And the term Zongo, often translated as Middle Kingdom or China, appears in early texts like the Book of Documents.
And it meant?
Originally something like the central state or center of the world. Later, various dynasties used it to refer to themselves, their domain.
So the term has been around, but its meaning evolved.
Definitely. But China, as a concrete sovereign nation state, comparable to modern countries, that becomes much clearer in the late Qing dynasty.
Late 1800s.
Yes, especially with increased interaction and conflict with Western powers in Japan and internal movements like the Xinhai Revolution. These events forced a need to define China in modern international terms.
A response to external pressures, in a way?
Partly, yes. And then, as we said, the Republic of China, 1912, and the People's Republic, 1949, really established China as the formal name and political subject of a modern nation.
Got it. So the modern political entity is much younger than the cultural roots.
So can cultural history be counted from the cultures of previous states in the same area? Let's look at the U.S. and Africa again, briefly.
Okay. The U.S. doesn't claim 500 years of British culture.
No. The narrative acknowledges British and European influence deeply, but U.S. cultural history is usually seen as starting with the colonial period or independence, around 1607 or 1776.
And indigenous history is acknowledged but treated separately from the main American culture timeline.
Generally, yes, due to that perceived cultural discontinuity from the perspective of the nation-state's founding narrative.
In Africa, nations there don't claim the 200,000 years of human origin as their specific national cultural history.
Correct. Modern borders are often colonial constructs, diversity is immense, so tracing a single line back that far for, say, Nigeria, doesn't align with how national identity formed.
They might reference being the cradle of humanity, but don't equate prehistoric Africa directly with the history of the modern state of Kenya, for instance.
Exactly. The focus is usually on more recent pre-colonial kingdoms relevant to their specific populations or the independence era.
So why is this 5,000 years of Chinese culture narrative so prevalent and, well, popular?
Our sources suggest a few key reasons. One is nationalism.
Building national pride.
Yes, emphasizing a long, continuous, glorious history, fosters cultural confidence and reinforces the idea of China as a major, enduring civilization, maybe even justifying its place in the world today.
Makes sense. What else?
Political legitimacy. Connecting the current state, the current regime, to this ancient lineage implies stability, continuity, and historical rightfulness.
Like saying, we are the natural inheritors of this grand tradition.
Something like that.
Yeah.
It provides a historical anchor for political authority.
And then there's that blurring of lines we talked about.
Right. Equating the enduring culture with the state and using the culture's longevity to claim a similar longevity for China as a concept, glossing over the dynastic changes, periods of division, and the evolution of the state itself.
It simplifies a very complex history into a neat, marketable package.
But this kind of rhetoric isn't without risks, as our sources point out.
Such as?
Distorting historical understanding is a big one. It can create a sense of inevitability or a natural legitimacy for a particular regime or even a dominant ethnic group, like the Han Chinese.
And that could sideline other groups or histories within China.
Potentially, yes. It risks suppressing cultural diversity by promoting one overarching narrative and excluding memories or identities that don't neatly fit.
And does it affect how people think about history?
It can perhaps weaken critical thinking about history. If you're constantly presented with this smooth, unbroken 5,000-year narrative, you might be less inclined to question it, to analyze the breaks, the conflicts, the constructions involved.
Well, less likely to use history as a tool to critically examine power structures.
That's a potential danger.
Yeah.
Now, our sources are careful to note that this kind of national historical sophistry, using history for political ends, happens worldwide to varying degrees.
They're not just China.
No.
Yeah.
But the sources suggest China's case is particularly thorough, deeply integrated into education and state messaging, and highly politicized.
Okay, one last look at the U.S. and Africa through this China logic lens.
If the U.S. applied it strictly.
We could claim 15,000 years via indigenous history. But our sources say we don't because the cultural and political continuity isn't there for the core U.S. identity, which is tied to the nation's founding.
The narrative is built differently, focusing on the creation of the modern state, not assembling ancient puzzle pieces.
And Africa, claiming 200,000 years.
Lacks academic validity for specific nations due to discontinuity, and lacks political relevance because modern identities are built on much more recent histories, indigenous civilizations, anti-colonial struggles.
They focus on narratives that are more directly connected to their current national context.
So why does this label of sophistry seem to stick more to the China narrative sometimes compared to the U.S. or Africa?
Yeah, why is that?
Our sources suggest a few reasons. China's situation is unique because there is a relatively high degree of cultural continuity in some aspects, language, certain philosophies, and very rich historical records.
Which gives the 5,000-year claim some basis.
Exactly. It has a stronger hook in reality than trying to link modern America directly to Clovis points. But that very real continuity also makes it easier to inflate or simplify into a nationalist narrative that blurs lines between culture and state, legend and fact.
And that inflation is what gets called sophistry.
That's often the critique, yes.
Yeah.
The exaggeration or selective interpretation for nationalist purposes.
Whereas the U.S., being an immigrant nation, emphasizes its founding, its break from the past. The narrative is about newness.
Less basis and less need to claim millennia of continuity.
And Africa, with its colonial borders and immense diversity, struggles to create a single unifying narrative tracing back to human origins. The focus is elsewhere.
Their historical narratives are often more about resisting colonial narratives or celebrating specific indigenous pasts.
And there might be a political dimension, too. China emphasizing its long history to build confidence, counter Western perspectives.
That's suggested as well. Cultural confidence and political needs play a role. The U.S. as a superpower perhaps feels less need to validate itself through ancient history. African nations focus on indigenous revival due to their specific colonial experience.
So, wrapping up the sophistry point, the 5,000 years has some cultural basis, but as a description of a continuous political entity called China, it overstates things. It simplifies, selects, and blurs lines, making it academically questionable, especially in a nationalist context.
But it's important to remember, constructing national historical narratives is common globally. Calling it sophistry requires understanding this broader context and being precise about what is being critiqued, usually the simplification and political use, rather than the cultural continuity itself.
All right, so let's try to pull this all together. We dove into this 5,000 years of Chinese culture claim, and wow, it's definitely not simple.
No, it's layered. The idea of China itself has changed dramatically over time.
And that distinction between cultural continuity, which is significant in China's case, and the history of a continuous political state is crucial.
Absolutely. We also saw how different the approaches are when you look at the U.S. or nations in Africa, how their unique histories shape the stories they tell about their past.
It really shows how history isn't just facts, but also narrative interpretation, and sometimes maybe a bit of marketing.
Nations select and shape their past to build identity and purpose for the present and future. It's a dynamic process.
So here's a final thought for you, our listeners, to chew on. Thinking about how nations build these stories, what do you see as the pros and cons of emphasizing a really, really long history versus maybe a shorter, more recent one?
How does stressing ancient roots versus, say, revolutionary beginnings impact national identity, or how a country sees its place in the world today?
Definitely something to mull over.
Indeed.
Okay. If you enjoyed this deep dive and want more explorations like this, please do subscribe to Sip and Talk. We'd appreciate it.
We would.
And also check out our friend Micky's YouTube channel. We're always plugging Micky. Got to support friends, right?
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, this was fascinating. It really makes you think twice when you hear those big historical numbers thrown around. Like, okay, 5,000 years, but what does that actually mean? It's like peeling an onion. Still smells like onion, but there are layers. Anyway, thanks for listening, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.